Sometimes things work out. The sun is conjunct Mercury today, right now. Had a nice day of getting some things done and talking to people. Lots of talking to people here. So this is number 52. Salvia and puppet friends. So this is a story about 9 years ago. We were having some trouble connecting, so we got off the Wi-Fi, which is a little weak and slow here. So this is a story about 9 years ago. I had moved to New York and started amassing things that I just didn't have the luxury of possessing when I was traveling. And I guess a couple people had contacted me and told me about salvia and said that salvia was going to be made illegal. And salvia, somebody asked me about that yesterday. What's salvia? Salvia is the Latin word for the genus that most sages fall in. So there's a lot of different plants that fall in the salvia category. There's ornamental plants and medicinal plants and cooking plants, culinary plants. This is a different plant. This is an entheogen, or a psychedelic, or hallucinogen, whatever you like to think of that class of chemical. But it's a plant, and the common English translation is diviner's sage. So the plant is native to Oaxaca, Mexico, which is a very high elevation, and it's kind of rainforesty. I tried to get it to grow in my apartment, and it was very unhappy for many years. A friend of mine just joined. The first time I ever ingested salvia in America was in Tennessee, and I had made a tincture out of it, and he and I and another friend drank some, and the other friend watched us while my good friend and I had wonderful, amazing sex on salvia. Salvia is not a party drug, though. And I wouldn't say it's good for sex, but somebody recently asked me, oh, is it good for sex? And I was like, well, I once had really amazing sex with a friend on salvia, but I pretty much always had amazing sex with them anyway. So it just kind of heightened the weird uniqueness that sex between us is, or just with him. So salvia, Oaxaca, Mexico. The way it's traditionally done there is they chew it, and it's got a very pungent, astringent taste. And Americans, well, people, common taste palates do not like things like that. So the way it's been appropriated into Western culture is they extract the juices out of it with like an alcohol solution and then layer it back into the plant leaf and dry it so it becomes super concentrated. And then they smoke it. And you can't smoke it with a Bic lighter because the active constituents don't vaporize at that temperature. You need like a blue flame cigar lighter or crack lighter, whichever your mind thinks of about that kind of thing. I had first been introduced to this when I lived in California in the year 2000, right after I arrived at this hippie commune where I slept under a tree for 2 months without a sleeping bag. A girl left, and she asked if I could take care of her plant. And it was very interesting to, she said, well, it likes to be talked to and sung to, and it needs a little water every day. So I gave it a little water every day, and I was like, let's talk and sing to a plant. And it was interesting that the plant, seemed to really like that. Whenever I'd walk back to my little camp, I'd be like, hi, how you doing? Didn't like direct sunlight, so it was it's a canopy plant, grows up in the rainforesty mountains. And I asked a friend there, a guy there who was living there, I said, have you ever ingested salvia divinorum? And he said, yeah, it was fucking terrifying. It was the worst thing I've ever ingested. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, it's a plant that really needs to be done with intention, and I was just experimenting. So I was alone in my yurt, and I took a hit, and I didn't feel like it did anything. And I looked down, and then I looked back up, and there was this old Native American woman sitting in a chair across from me. And she was just looking at me really intensely, and she didn't say anything, but there was like this energy of, what the fuck do you want? And I ran screaming, and I ran outside, and I was like, wow. So 6 years later, I was traveling around Europe, and somebody I'd met on the internet invited me to come stay with him in Hamburg, and I got there, and he wasn't there. He all of a sudden wasn't replying to messages. He wasn't answering his phone, wasn't returning messages. So I was walking around Hamburg. I got some little room, but I just felt everything was off. And sometimes when traveling, all the portals opened up and everything was just magic and flowing and wonderful and wow, these people are great, everybody loves me. And sometimes when traveling, nothing works. All the doors don't open. You always arrive when the train's pulling away from the platform or the shop is just closed. And I was having one of those times. And so I was walking around and I saw this head shop. And I walked in and they had salvia. And I was like, oh, everything I've heard about this is that if you have a specific intention, this might help. So I bought some and I walked into the forest. There was a big foresty thing across the street from where this head shop was. I don't know the geography of Hamburg, so that's the only time I was there well enough to know even what the hell part of town I was in. I walked in the middle of the forest off of the trails, and I sat down and I put it in my mouth because I remember that that's the way they traditionally did it. And I just sucked it and started meditating. And within a not very long period of time, it felt like my sense of self telescoped out into multiple dimensions, and I was able to kind of extend and integrate myself with the universe around me, and then pull back in to myself, and everything just made sense. Like all of a sudden I was like, oh, now I'm like reconnected with my inner guidance. I know where to go. I know how to make things work again. And everything just flowed from there on in. And I ended up going to Berlin, and somebody gave me an apartment to stay in for a month, and I met all these amazing people and had a great time. So it can be used for specific things. If you know, a lot of these plants, even like cannabis, that a lot of people just use as play toy, because there was a period when salvia was really popular because like Miley Cyrus did it, and there were, I think, hundreds of videos on YouTube of kids smoking salvia and just laughing and making fun of each other and playing practical jokes on each other. You know, like LSD or mushrooms, it's really not the best use of a sacred plant to fuck around with it, but it's where we live, the world we live in. We live in America. You can do whatever you want. This is America. You can do whatever you want. You can come and you can share food with us, or you can put cement on everything and, you know, kill everyone. It's America. You can do whatever you want. So when I moved to New York, I had never smoked it, and I feel like I just got a lot of people telling me, oh yeah, salvia, they're trying to make it illegal. It's very dangerous, and there are lots of people that have, you know, in salvia, and it disconnected me now. Call came through. So I started doing some research online and, you know, reading about, like, oh, somebody smoked salvia every day for a year and then killed themselves. I'm like, oh, this is dangerous. This is some of the bad news about salvia. But then other people were saying this is the strongest hallucinogen known to science, gram for gram. And I just wanted to experience what I could do with the plant. So I ordered a live plant, and like they had a discount like for 15 grams, I don't know, for like $70. I don't remember what it was. So I bought a bunch, and I started experimenting with it. And it's a terrifying plant, because when you smoke it, it's kind of like you get punched in the face and roll back into another dimension. This first time I did it in Tennessee, like I told you, I had a really amazing sex with my friend from drinking the tincture I made. But then I went off alone and laid on some trees that had fallen over a chasm, which I really loved, because like being suspended between space like that, very shamanistic, liminal space to be in. That was the first time I smoked it, and I remember I took a little hit, and I was like, no, I need some more. And when I took more, my body was like, you really need to lay down. And I was like, oh, okay. And I laid down, and basically like my body became a passive object, and my sense of self was separate, and I was able to like feel that. And I was like, oh, interesting. I'm laying in this husk of a body that's no longer something I identify with. And then it was like a dimension cracked open, as if you can imagine you were in an egg, and like the wall just went, and I was like, wow. And through that little crack were a bunch of people that I knew from years earlier when I did mushrooms and acid kind of regularly. I never did them a lot, but I did them more regularly and was doing meditation and really trying to get the fuck out of this dimension. So I like stood up out of my body and I walked over and I was like, hey guys. And they were like, hey, Dominic. And I was like, and they're like, yeah, we're really busy right now. I was like, oh, I haven't seen you in so long. They're like, yeah, you can use one of the machines if you want, but really busy. So there was this place I used to call the Compound. I might talk more about that later, but I was all of a sudden in the Compound again, which is, I guess I'll just give a little idea, was that it was the place I felt that was like a reality outside of this dimension where people were kind of creating and organizing this dimension. And they were kind of like archetypes that mostly made up the people in this realm. That most of the people in this realm were blends of the archetypes of the people in this room. And there was only like 12 or 13 people in the room. I never got a clear number of how many. But I knew all of them. I felt like these were my friends. And I was not, like, this is not just an archetype. This is a blend of the different beings in there. And I was like, oh, yeah, yeah. But there were also like portals that you could look through. Like, they were kind of like terminals that you could dial in and out of different aspects of reality, so you could kind of manipulate them and control them. So I was like, oh wow. And they're like, yeah, we're busy. And I hadn't seen them for many years, like been in the Compound. But they didn't seem at all interested in seeing me. So I was like, oh, okay. But they're like, you're welcome to use one of the machines if you want. So I sat down and I was trying to figure out how to become the person I wanted to be. I was on the brink of making a big life change because I just moved to New York. So I was like, okay, how do I make the best use of this time? How do I become the person that I want to be? How do I achieve the goals that I want to achieve? And so I'm looking through this portal and I'm like, how is change made? And it's like, oh, well, that's what time is for. You have to live through things and have occurrences that repeat over and over that build up belief, faith, understanding, truth, reality. That's how reality is formed. We come to believe certain things, and then we assume them. We function in a space of taking things for granted, so we can just function. You know, we're like, oh, this is something I know what it is, and this is how it functions, and this is who I am, and this is how I respond to things. But how do you change that? Well, because it's such an elaborate build-up that requires time, I got to see this very detailed model of deconstructing it and reconstructing it, because you need a working model to function in reality, unless you're just like a, psychotic break schizophrenic person. But it takes time to slowly let go of the beliefs you hold about yourself and the world and how it works, and then create new ones. And there's obviously this time of shuffling where you're like, this belief doesn't really work with this belief, but I'm going to try to hold both at the same time while kind of letting go, where they can stay functioning. Descartes, this is kind of I was talking to somebody who might be watching right now because he just signed on a moment ago. And he was talking about how he took philosophy classes, and he was like, I don't remember what their philosophies were, but I remember their names, and I could definitely talk philosophy when. I remember Descartes saying something like, when you really want to change your foundation of your philosophy of reality, generally you have to put yourself in someone else's home. Meaning that when you find your philosophy is no longer functional, you go into someone else's philosophy. So imagine that you've been an atheist your whole life, but you're really not happy. So you're just like, okay, I'm going to be a born-again Christian for a couple years because it's functional. That's a really extreme example, but it's like, okay, it's a functional thing that it has ways that people believe and it works. And then while you're in there, you get to restructure yourself, and then you can pull yourself out of it. So he was making this whole metaphor because somebody gave him a house he could use somewhere out in the middle of, I remember it was France or Switzerland, and he had like a little stove in it. And so he talked about the importance of keeping your stove lit. Everything is a metaphor of philosophy, right? So I was really impressed that I was able to clearly see how time and personality construction worked. And it was something that I felt like I innately knew when I was younger, but I'd forgotten and was confused about. And I jumped up out of the salvia trip as soon as I had all these realizations clicking into place, and I kind of ran up the hill, and I saw the first person I knew, which is a fairy who goes by the name of Ribbon, and I was like, hey, Ribbon, and I didn't know him very well. I was like, you're a shaman, right? And he was like, I guess so, yeah. And I said, I just described the experience I had to him, and I said, how do you stay in that level of clarity? And he was like, well, you don't. You can't live like a human in that level of clarity. That's what crazy people are. It's really important to be able to go into those levels of clarity and then come out and function as a person. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. I forgot. Which gets us back to number 52, which is on the list of stories I have. Puppet friend. So I had a bunch of salvia. I was working with it in New York, giving it to like 200 people over a 2-year period, which I may tell more stories about later if it comes up in the random number generator. I had been teaching yoga to some friends over in Brooklyn, which I still do when I'm in Brooklyn. I teach yoga to these guys. But for a little while, it was a small group of people. And when I started doing salvia, I mentioned it to them, and they said, why don't you bring it over? So after yoga one night, we were doing yoga 3 nights a week for a while, and then 2 nights a week. And so it was very frequently over at their house. I brought over some salvia with me, and this must have been early on, because there was this friend that I was kind of dating, and it was very reluctant. I was trying not to date him, but I just, because I didn't want to have a boyfriend, but then all of a sudden we were boyfriends. Like, sometimes you willingly go into like, oh, we're boyfriends, and sometimes you really like someone, or you even love someone, and they just call you all the time, so you end up spending all your time with them, and you're like, I really love you, but I don't want to spend all my time with you. So he was like that. I was spending all my time with him. And I could very clearly see that he was like a brother archetype. I saw a lot of myself in him, and there was a lot of difference. And I was merging my identity with him a lot, which is something I used to do a lot. I don't know if I still do, because I don't fall in love with people. I've like kind of put the kibosh on that. Did it a couple years ago, and it really hurt. But I don't know if I did as much identity confluxing. But back then, this is the year 2007, 8, I would collapse into identities. I would take people as being a part of my identity. And me and one of the guys from the guys I was teaching yoga to, it was not the first time we'd smoked salvia together, but we decided to do it in a more intentional setting of kind of like meditating a little bit and seeing where we could go with it. And I was the third person to go, so I always really liked holding space for people. I would always tell people, so when you smoke salvia, you usually pretty much entirely lose contact with this level of reality, and your body becomes paralyzed. And I would say, I think that it's the same mechanism in your brain that is triggered when you're dreaming, so that you're not a sleepwalker and you're not talking in your sleep. And of course, some people do talk in their sleep, and some people are somnambulists. But salvia seems to trigger that same thing, because you have full hallucinatory realms you live in or die in, or whatever happens to you. Not die usually, but there's usually a lot of that edgy death stuff happening, at least for me and various people I've given it to. And I said, and you can't talk or move very well, most people. And very often you'll feel an impulse to want to talk or move once the idea of yourself in this world comes back into closeness, which takes a while before it integrates again. But the trip, when you smoke it, is only like 7 or 10 minutes, very short. So I'd say, you're going to feel like you want to talk. I encourage you not to talk. I encourage you to lay back and just be in the experience and take it as long as you can. And I promise you, even if you feel like reality's falling apart, I will be here. We will be here holding reality together for you when you come back. So the other 2 friends went before me, and I was like doing Reiki on them, and they had their experience. They both laid down. And this time I decided not to lay down. This time I'm just like, what happens if I sit up? What if I just stay sitting up? And one of the things I love about salvia is when I gave it to people, when they got high, I would feel this sensation ripple up my spine and go out through my head. And then I would usually start to giggle. They would start to giggle, and then they'd pass out. So this time I was like, let me just not be giddy, not be tickled. Let me just try to be with that sensation. And I would start to feel like my teeth, each individual tooth was biting itself. That's what the sensation felt like. And I specifically remember this time I'm like meditating. So I don't go super deep into it, but it lasts. I think I was in it. It felt like a half hour or 40 minutes. I'm in it for a very long time, compared to like 7 minutes or 10 minutes. And in this specific time, I start to lean forward, and it feels like my face is pressing into some kind of strata, some kind of matrix. And when I realize that there's a difference between my face and whatever it's pressing, I start to try to lift my face out of it. And as I was describing earlier about time and the changing of time and all the dimension layers that build up time and self and sense of self, I realized that as I started to pull myself back up, that I was pulling myself out of a very specific reality, and the entirety of time and truth was malleable. And it wasn't malleable in a metal or clay kind of way, because that seems very fluid and kind of easy to manipulate. It all felt a bit like Legos. It was all geometric and modular. There were units that were liftable and replaceable. And it didn't have to be manually done, but it was that intricately blocky. And I was like, oh, what's going on here? And I was like, well, if I can pull out, and as I would lift up and there would be space between the modules, I could see into eternity and the limitless potential available between each of the blocks of believable objects. And I had this very clear understanding that I was like, wow, if I really believed this enough, if I had enough, enough faith and enough skill, I could lift reality apart and restructure it and come back to sobriety or sanity or normalcy, reality, and it could be entirely different. I was here in New York wondering what the hell I was going to do and how I was going to make it work, and I was like, if I do this right, I can come out of this trip and already be a famous artist. I can be at this big show in this big gallery right now. And I could see it right over my right shoulder because I was kind of slumped to my left. I could see it right over my right shoulder, and I felt that if I started to turn to it, everything hurt a lot because a lot of little pieces were moving and rearranging. And it was nice. I felt it right over my right shoulder, and I was like, I could turn, and I could... But I felt how disrespectful that is to people who have gone to school and done all the ass-kissing and done all the work and done all the study and honed their skills, as some of them have, not all of them, but honed their skills to actually kind of earn, because sometimes earning and sometimes it's just the gift of fate, a type of fame and wealth. And I was like, yeah, this is one of the problems with being this kind of manipulative powermonger wizard, is that you could just steal any truth, any reality you want, but it's not exactly fair to other beings. And this became a very pivotal crux in my philosophical view of the world, because up until this point, I would repeatedly fall into a type of solipsism, which, if you don't know, means that you believe you are the center of the universe, and not just in an unconscious teenager kind of way, but really feeling like putting out tests and getting back verifiable proof that the whole world revolved around me. And not necessarily me as Dominic, but that the knowing that was available through this portal of sensual awareness really was the center of the world, or was the only thing. And if I tapped into it correctly, I could really just create any reality I wanted. But the problem with that is that if you can create any reality you want, then other people are just kind of pawns in your story. You can't ever really have a relationship. You can't ever really have friends. Because everybody's just kind of cardboard cutouts of you. And at this point, I'm coming out of the depth of the high, but I'm holding on to it in this meditative clarity. And I open my eyes and I look at my two friends who are watching me, and they're silent. And the older man, who was one of the owners of this house, I looked at him and I could see he was a very separate person with a very real reality that, again, there was a brotherliness between us. Like, I really saw, and it's funny because as our friendship progressed over the years, there was a period where lots of people would kind of mistake us for each other. And he's over 20 years older than me, and he just looks very different. But we both have this kind of leonine quality and a type of beauty and a type of big-hairedness and a lot of it. Even his lover at one point in time, I showed him an old picture of me, and he was like, "Oh, that's a really nice picture." Anyway, thought it was his husband. Thought it was a picture. Thought me was a picture of him. And his mother once mistook a picture of me as a picture of him. So anyway, I look at him, but I can see our similarities, but I can also see, and I can feel the resonance of our heart, but I can see he's also a different person. And this other guy who loves me and is kind of being my boyfriend, and I'm reluctantly being his boyfriend, a big part of me always felt like, again, I was conflating my identity with him. I was losing the boundary between who I was and who he was. And so I looked at him, and I could feel a cord of energy going underneath the floor, which was really underneath reality, and coming up behind him, and I could see myself in his eyes. And I had been fucking him a lot, and there's a big part of me that believes part of sexual magic is that you put a type of, like, if you imagine you eat food and you drink air and you drink water and you drink substances and you think thoughts, you bring in energy through your head and skin and face and attention. To a certain degree, we're digesting the attention that people give us, the love and adoration and admiration, whatever. That's your essence, right? And then if you fuck someone, you're pumping it into someone. Especially if you do it with that intention, which is really the way I am. I'm very full bore when it comes to things like that. And so similarly, like a lot of people when they're having sex, they may have a type of vampireness, which might be unconscious, and they just want to suck the life force out of people because they don't feel like they have an essence. Or they might come to it more as an acolyte or a sacred ritualistic worshiper, perhaps saying like, oh, I want to eat the body of Jesus, or I want to drink the milk of Ganesha, I want to be one with Shiva and take him into my body. There are a lot of good like religious metaphors for this, because that's kind of one of the bases of Tantra, to welcome the God form into you and be imbued with its essence. But of course we can all be gods too if we step the fuck up to it. So I look at him and I see a lot of my essence in him because I had been fucking him a lot and coming at him. But he seemed kind of two-dimensional. Like, I was like, wow, my relationship with him is I'm basically just like filling him up with myself and making him what I want him to be. And he is so eager to be filled and to just be what I want him to be. And since then, I've had friends who showed me that movie, Christopher and Dawn, about Christopher Isherwood and his lover, Dawn, who basically Dawn just became a weird, like, continuation of Christopher. Like, his voice changed, his look changed, the whole way he did everything was just basically what Christopher programmed into him. And then we have Behind the Candelabra, where Liberace literally made his boyfriend into a version of him. And this is not uncommon. You've seen couples that have been together a long time, people are like, are you guys brothers? Because they just become so the same. And that's not what all sex has to be about. It doesn't have to be about breeding someone with yourself, sucking a lot of life force from the world to generate a self-essence that you plug into your partner so that they're like a willing receptacle and willing companion to everything you want to do because you've made them that. They were an empty vessel you filled with yourself. A lot of us, are, especially bottom-minded people, are very attracted to that kind of fantasy if they were able to articulate it like I just did. But I was horrified seeing this because I was like, I don't want a puppet. I want someone who is really challenging me and nourishing me. I want someone who's real. I don't want to be a solipsist who's existing in a vacuum. And then there's an ellipsis. Someone will lead you to someone, will lead you to someone, will lead you to the one at the end of the century. Right in sync with the lyrics. That's brilliant. Great. Hi. So I came out of that high and grounded in a type of horror and confusion because the older friend, I remember the end of that trip now. I settled back into the reality of the continuity of my life, but I had this clarity of the relationship I was in and the relationship I had with this friend who owned this house. And I realized that the whole house was kind of a metaphor of the dreams of his life. And I saw cracks in the walls. All buildings have cracks in the walls. All buildings have problems. But I saw them as direct expressions, as the metaphor of his struggle with aging. that experience, because I was talking about aging yesterday, or was that this morning? The inevitable crumbling of the buildings. Have you ever been to Italy and seen all the beauty falling apart? It can fall apart for hundreds of years, but everything eventually crumbles. And I was able to see his house, which was anything that's ours is an expression of us in part. And I remember mourning that I was like, my friend is crumbling and aging. This beautiful world he's created is falling apart. And that's normal. That's the truth for every single one of us. But it seemed like a horrible experience. What age was I? I was like 29, maybe I just turned 30. The inevitability of aging. And the guy who was my boyfriend, who wasn't my boyfriend, I just became terrified of him being a puppet. I would get him to try to prove that he wasn't a puppet, and it just became, I wasn't totally in love with myself. I had a lot of hang-ups and landmines, self-created landmines and pitfalls and so on and so forth that he would trigger, because then he was just, a puppet of my choosing. And to be fair, he did have some great wisdom that would surface every once in a while, but he was really good at being passive, and he didn't really care. He didn't feel like he needed to show up all the time like that. But I think that was a very big turning point for me, where I was like, wow, how do I really stop being a solipsist? Putting a period there. So one of the reasons I decided to do one last night, one this morning, and one now, because I've been so lazy about doing this project. Not lazy, I've just been not feeling the groove. I used that profile picture a couple weeks ago where I was like, I guess I don't have to make this linear. And I had been waiting until I made all of the stories linear, like in a line, before I numbered them. And I just realized, I was like, I guess I don't have to make this linear. I can just number them as they are, and I'm going to play them randomly. They don't need to be told linearly. They don't need to be organized linearly. Whatever is useful in any storytelling will bubble out, will precipitate out for those who dip in at that moment, or weather it through to that moment, or if I do indeed listen to them and transcribe them, or if somebody else transcribes them. Something useful will come out when it needs to come out. But Mercury is conjunct the Sun today, and it's a wonderful opportunity to express. So I may as well take it. Easy to get distracted with other things, easy to say things wrong, easy to be clear and be perceptive, easy to talk. I've been doing a lot of talking lately, staying with this Gemini friend. It's been great. And I guess I don't need to make this linear means I can tell this story without giving a moral at the end. And then they all lived happily ever after. And then he realized he was on a sinking ship, and his only job was to witness it with an open heart and stay present. There is no fixing. There is no fixing. Witness with an open heart, stay present. That was something I learned from that night as well. Any questions, or is that enough? There's 8 people watching right now, apparently. Any questions, or is that enough? Remember, if you have any questions, you can write them down and schedule an interview, and we can do like an interview live video where you ask me questions. I do have a couple people who have already asked me to do talks that were all languishing because I wasn't ready to do this yet, and maybe I'll address one of those soon. That sounds like it might be a nice idea. So enough of this now. I hope you've enjoyed this weird backlit view. I am naked in the sun. And thank you, Kif. And I'm going to unplug for a moment and be quiet. Thank you for all these opportunities we've had to experience and learn things. David, what I have learned from all of this is what I am expressing in story. What I have learned from all of this is what I'm living. What I have learned from all of this is what I'm releasing and letting go. What I have learned from all of this is what I am trying to express. I think that's probably the best answer I can give to that question.